horror hounds. Today we're having a slasher showdown of Freddy versus Jason. But we're not talking about the movie. Instead, we're going to be looking at the infamous NES games, brought to us by the Laughin' Jokin' Numbnuts. So, let's go ahead and get started with Friday the 13th. This game has you playing as a group of camp counselors at Camp Crystal Lake. There are 6 different counselors in total, and you can switch between them throughout the game. Some of them share the same name as characters from the movies, but none of them actually are characters from the movies. Each of the counselors has their own statistics, making some better than others, and Mark is strictly the best character. See, it's pretty obvious this isn't the same Mark from Part 2. Although it would have been kinda interesting to see how they would handle that character in a video game. The basic goal is to protect the children from Jason, who are camping in the cabins at the center of Camp Crystal Lake, while also making sure that at least one of the counselors survives, making this game one of the earliest examples of the survival horror genre. The gameplay switches between traditional side-scrolling action, and it changes over to an early example of third-person perspective whenever you go into one of the cabins. Whenever you start the game, it tells you that you should use the torch to light the fireplaces, but to be honest, that's actually pretty pointless. However, it is a really good idea to get the torch because it is one of the strongest weapons in the game. The way that you get new weapons though is pretty convoluted and it's kinda hard to figure out. Your starting weapon is a rock, which is pretty crappy, but you have to kill a certain number of enemies with it before you get the knife. The weird thing about this is that each of the counselors has to kill a different number of enemies before they get the knife to appear. And you have to get the knife first before you can get any of the stronger weapons. Once you understand how this works, you can get the torch pretty quickly, but without a guide, you'd probably have no idea what was going on. Also, another thing to keep in mind is that you can only carry one weapon at a time. So if you get a good weapon like the torch, and then you go ahead and accidentally pick up a knife, then you kinda just screwed yourself over. Another weird thing about this game is that certain items, like keys or vitamins, will only appear if you jump a certain number of times. And that really doesn't make any sense. Another part of this game that's a bit nonsensical is the enemies that you fight, like zombies, crows, and wolves. I don't exactly remember any of that from the movies. Another thing I don't remember from the movies is Jason killing little kids, but in this game he certainly does just that. When the Jason alarm goes off, you have a short amount of time to get to the cabins in the center of the campground and prevent the kids from being killed. Now, to be fair, this is probably inspired by Part 6, where Jason actually does go into the kids' cabin, but he doesn't kill any of them. But in this game, Jason ain't fucking around, and he got no problems with killing little kids. So if you let them all die, it's game over for you.
So, what were you gonna be when you grew up?
Now, sometimes when the Jason alarm goes off, it's not the kids he's attacking, but it's your fellow camp counselors. When this happens, you have to check the map and figure out which cabin the counselor is in and try to make it there in time. Now, speaking of the map, this is one of the things in the game that people find the most confusing. The reason for this is because in the side-scrolling gameplay, you're either walking left or right, but you also have to keep in mind whether or not you're going north, east, south, or west. But there's actually a really easy way to figure this out. If you're walking left, then you're going clockwise on the map. And if you're walking to the right, then you're going counterclockwise on the map. If you just keep this in mind, then you probably shouldn't have too much trouble finding your way around Camp Crystal Lake. The only time you really have to worry about getting lost is if you go into the woods or the caves. The woods are just confusing as fuck, and the only reason you should go into them is when you're trying to get a couple of key items, namely the torch. And you should just completely avoid the woods in the south part of the map because there's nothing in there worth getting. The caves aren't nearly as confusing as the woods, and the cool thing about them is that you can fight Pamela Voorhees' disembodied head in there. If you defeat her, then you get her sweater, and that reduces the amount of damage that you take from Jason. I actually think this sub-boss is one of the coolest parts in the game, because it's a nice little reference to Friday the 13th Part 2. Now it's time to talk about the main boss of the game, which is of course Jason Voorhees himself. So the really interesting thing about Jason is that it seems like he could show up in the game anywhere at any time. In this way, he's kind of like Mr. X in the Resident Evil 2 remake, which makes him a very interesting boss, especially for an NES game. When he attacks the children or one of the other camp counselors, then you know where he's going to be, and you have a chance to fight him inside the cabins. Fighting him this way is a little bit like Mike Tyson's Punch-Out, but it's actually really difficult, and it gets harder as the game progresses. So it's a better idea if you can fight him out on the road in the side-scrolling part of the game. And there's actually a little trick you can use to manipulate Jason to avoid fighting him in the cabins, which is a good idea. If you can defeat Jason once, then you'll have to beat him 2 more times, because the game is broken up into 3 separate days, and he gets stronger on each day. Of course, if Jason kills you, then you get one of the best game over screens in the history of games, informing you that you and all your friends are dead. And I'd say it's a safe bet that you are going to see this screen at least a few times while playing this game, because it is a very difficult game. But now I think it's time that we go ahead and check in on Springwood, where Freddy Krueger, the man of your dreams, is waiting for you in a nightmare on Elm Street. So this game is a straight-up side-scrolling action platformer where you play as a nameless Elm Street teenager. Your goal is to get through each stage where Freddy will be waiting for you in a different form for a boss fight, until the final stage when you fight Freddy in his true form. In order to get through each stage, you have to collect all of Freddy's bones within the level. And of course, this is a reference to Nightmare on Elm Street Part 3 where they collect all of Freddy's bones to bury them. Now, as you're playing through the game, you have to keep an eye on your sleep meter, because of course if you fall asleep then you'll drift into a nightmare. The sleep meter is constantly going down, and it goes down even faster if you stand still. But you can find coffee throughout the levels to help keep you awake. Eventually, you are going to fall asleep though, and this is when you enter the Nightmare Realm. Not a whole lot really changes here though, except the enemies are different and they're a little stronger. And the enemies in this game are just as nonsensical as they were in Friday the 13th, because you fight things like bats and rats and shamblers, things that the kids in the movies never had to deal with. And when you go into a nightmare, the enemies turn into spookier things like skeletons and ghosts, which makes a little more sense because I guess anything could happen in a nightmare. The cool thing about entering the dream world is that you get to use dream powers, much like the Dream Warriors in Part 3. There's 3 of these power-ups and you can pick them up in the waking world. There's the Acrobat power, which is probably inspired by Christian from Part 3. And then there's the Necromancer power, which is definitely a reference to Will, the Wizard Master, also from Part 3. And then there's the Ninja power-up, or wait, I mean the Shadow Warrior power-up, which is a reference to Lo Wang, the Shadow Warrior.
Who want some wang?
Nah, I'm just kidding, it's probably a reference to Rick from Part 4. Anyways, these power-ups are all pretty useful, and you're gonna need to use them if you want to have any chance of beating Freddy. And speaking of Freddy, if you take too long in a level messing around, you'll get the Freddy's Coming message. And as you can clearly see here, the name Freddy is trademarked. So if that just so happens to be your name, well then sorry, but fuck you, it belongs to New Line Cinema and or LJN Games. So you're gonna have to change your name, bro. Oh yeah, I also forgot to mention that the coffee cups turn into boomboxes in the dream world, and they play this rockin' little tune to wake you up, which I think is supposed to be kinda like Dawkins from Part 3. Now, getting back to the bone collecting, it can be kind of a pain in the ass sometimes, because some of the bones are really hard to see. They put some of them in places where they blend in really well with the rest of the level, and you could easily miss them. And this can get pretty annoying sometimes when you have to go backtracking through the level. Another thing that's kind of annoying is that you won't know which house you're supposed to go in when you start a new game. They randomize the order of the houses on every new playthrough. And the doors on the houses can be misleading because some of them are opened and some of them are closed, and this never changes. So the house that you're supposed to go in might have a closed door, or the house that you're not supposed to go in might have an open door. It can be kind of confusing. Fortunately, this problem goes away after the third stage because the last 4 stages are played in a fixed order. And I gotta say, it's pretty cool that all the levels in the game relate to the movies, at least to some degree. First off, you've got the houses, which could be any of the houses on Elm Street where the kids live. Then you've got the cemetery, which doesn't have as strong of a correlation to the movies, but a cemetery does appear in at least one of the films. Then there's the high school, which definitely makes sense because all the kids on Elm Street go to high school, and you see them in high school in multiple films. And of course there's the junkyard, which is seen in parts 3 and 4, and Freddy's house, which is also referenced in the film series. So that pretty much covers A Nightmare on Elm Street on NES, and now it's time for us to compare it to Friday the 13th and see who has the better NES game, Freddy or Jason. So first off, I want to start by saying that for LJN games on the NES, these games really aren't that bad. LJN has a pretty bad reputation, and it's well deserved in some cases, but a lot of people don't seem to realize that LJN was just the publisher. They used a number of different development teams to make their games. In the case of these 2 games, A Nightmare on Elm Street was made by Rare, which is a developer that made a lot of good games. And Friday the 13th was developed by Atlas, who's also made some pretty decent games over the years. Now these games were made in the developers' earlier years before they really hit their stride, but I think their potential really shows through in these 2 titles. Now moving forward with the comparison, I want to talk about the music. Friday the 13th's music was composed by Hirohiko Takayama, and I gotta say the cabin theme is fucking awesome. It really creates a spooky atmosphere for this game. Unfortunately, there's only 3 other songs in the game, and while they're not bad, they are very short and very repetitive. The music for A Nightmare on Elm Street was composed by David Wise, who made the excellent soundtrack for Donkey Kong Country, as well as many other games. The music in Nightmare is also really good and helps create a creepy atmosphere. And there's a lot more songs in this game, so when it comes to music, I have to give the win to Nightmare on Elm Street. Next up I want to talk about the graphics, and they're both pretty close in this department. Neither of them have particularly amazing art, but they both get the job done. Now, I really love the Nintendo version of Jason Voorhees in Friday the 13th, and I also think Pamela Voorhees' head is kind of a cool piece of art too. But I gotta say, there's more variety and color in the graphics in A Nightmare on Elm Street. So when it comes to the art, I think Nightmare just barely edges out Friday in this category. Now I want to talk about how well both of these games adapted their source material. And I gotta say, I think they both did a pretty good job. I mean, sure, there's a few things in the games that don't really make sense when compared to the movies, but you're always going to get that from a video game based on a film. But I think they both did a pretty good job making gameplay mechanics that were based on the movies. And I'd say they also both adapted the settings pretty well too. I mean, by comparison, there's a lot worse movie adaptations out there for games, especially in the NES era. I mean, just look at Back to the Future. But now it's time to talk about the really important stuff, which is the gameplay and the game design. Now, looking at Nightmare on Elm Street, it has really conventional gameplay for its time. It didn't take a lot of chances, and it really just followed what its contemporaries were doing. They went with a pretty standard style of gameplay for Nintendo games of that era, which is a side-scrolling action platformer. You've got pretty standard enemies, standard power-ups, standard collection mechanics, and standard boss fights. Now on the plus side, this definitely helps make the game more accessible to its target audience. But on the negative side, it's not exactly doing very much to innovate, aside from the sleep mechanic. Now we take a look at Friday the 13th, and while the game is kind of hard to understand, especially for gamers in 1989, in a lot of ways this game's design was ahead of its time. What you've got here is essentially a survival horror game with non-linear gameplay and a free-roaming boss. And while some of the game's mechanics could have been communicated to the player better, you still can't deny that they were very innovative for 1989. So taking these design choices into consideration, I've got to say personally, I think Friday the 13th is the better game. I could understand how young gamers on the Nintendo might have liked Nightmare on Elm Street better at the time, because it was a lot easier to understand and more straightforward. However, when you look at these games' designs, Friday the 13th clearly just had a lot more thought put into it. Now, of course, both of these games have their fair share of flaws, which prevent them from being classics on the same level as Super Mario Bros. Or even Battletoads. However, I don't think either of them are as bad as their reputation makes them out to be. Of course, in my opinion, Friday the 13th is a little bit of a better game than Nightmare on Elm Street. But I definitely think they're both worth playing if you're interested in retro games and you're a fan of both of these horror series. So that brings us to the end of this fight. Freddy versus Jason on the NES. And in my opinion, Jason is the winner. But this fight was only about the NES games. And I'm not ready to announce my winner when it comes to the movies. Not just yet. Perhaps I'll get to that in a future video, but we shall see. In the meantime, I'd love to know what you think about these games in the comments below. And if you liked the video, why don't you go ahead and murder that like button. Also, don't forget to subscribe if you'd like to see more content. Until next time, I hope you all have a happy Halloween.